Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you're watching or listening to this episode. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and it is my great privilege to lead discussions on all things Bible and theology with some of my favorite Bible scholars and Bible expositors. And I'm pleased this week to have on the program Dr. Benjamin Laird. Dr. Laird is discussing with me the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul, which is the contents of a recently released book that he co-authored with Miguel Echevarria entitled 40 Questions About the Apostle Paul. Dr. Laird is an associate professor of biblical studies at Liberty University. He teaches a variety of courses in the New Testament and in Greek. In addition to his teaching experience, he has served in various capacities in the church, including pastorates in Virginia and Scotland. His doctoral research examined the formation and circulation of the collection of Pauline letters in early Christianity. Dr. Laird is a fellow alumnus of the Word of Life Bible Institute, where he earned a diploma in biblical studies. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Liberty University, a Master of Divinity from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, a Master of Theology also from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, a Master of Letters from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and a PhD from the University of Aberdeen. Now, before I unload some of my questions to Dr. Laird, I'd like to express a special thanks to Kriegel Publishing for sending me a free copy of this excellent book to review and to lead our discussion today. Kriegel has also agreed to send a free copy to one of you, and I will send an additional free copy to another one of you. So if you would like to be entered into a drawing to receive one of these two books being given away, published by Kriegel, entitled 40 Questions About the Apostle Paul, all you need to do is head over to our YouTube page, Bible and Theology Matters, and like this episode and share this episode on one or more of your social media platforms. Then please leave me a comment on our YouTube channel that you have reposted the episode. Now, if you don't use YouTube, but you are on Facebook or Instagram, you can go over to our Bible and Theology Matters account and repost it, share it on Facebook or Instagram. Again, make sure to send me a note on YouTube, preferably, but if you don't have a YouTube account, you can also post a comment on our Facebook or Instagram accounts that you have reposted this episode. In 2 weeks from the release of this episode, we will have a drawing for the 2 free copies of this book. So thanks for your help in getting the word out. Now to our conversation with Dr. Laird about the book he has co-authored entitled 40 Questions About the Apostle Paul. Dr. Laird, what was the process that led you and your co-author, Dr. Echevarria, to write this book?
Good question to get us going there. I always find the story of books interesting. I don't know that my story here is all that interesting, but unlike a lot of people, there's constantly ideas in my mind of things I want to write, and you're constantly asking not just what I want to write, but how I'm going to publish that, in what form and where, and those types of questions. And I did my doctoral work on the historical background of Paul's writings, really the issue of canon, how the books came together to form one collection. So I've been in the world of Paul for a while, and I wanted to continue that, but I didn't want to do, just kind of a repeat of my doctoral work. I wanted it to be more of a accessible book that maybe my students could use. So I was thinking in terms of a survey or a brief introduction to Paul that graduate students could use, possibly even undergrad students. So I was familiar with the 40 Questions series. I know a lot of your listeners have probably read different books in that series as well. I know I have and benefited from them. Just a unique format that I think is very practical, and it forces the authors to be very concise but still cover a lot of ground. So I knew about the series, and I contacted Ben Merkel. He's the series editor, and just asked what he thought about the idea. And he really liked it. I thought it would complement well another volume in the series on the historical Jesus. So I'm thinking, well, we'll have a book on the Gospels and maybe one on Paul. So you can have a lot of the New Testament covered then, right? And he actually told me that there was another individual who was interested in also producing the same volume, and that's my co-author, Miguel. And so the two of us then teamed. He introduced us, and we, I think, formed a great team right away, because Miguel is he's written much more, I would say, on the theology of Paul than I have, and my focus, as I said a minute ago, because of my work on the canon, I focus a little more on historical matters. And so when you look at the scope of the work here, there's a lot of historical issues, a lot of theological issues. So naturally, that worked really well for the two of us to kind of divide it up and complement each other in that way. So two of us got started on it. And as I said, we formed a great team, and it was great to work with him on this. And I hope that we learned a lot from each other. I know I learned a lot from him. So but I'm really happy with how it turned out, and hope it serves the church well and the students as well.
In your introduction, Dr. Laird, you address the question, as many authors do, why another book on this particular subject? And I think that you answered that question quite well. There are indeed a lot of books on Paul and the theology of Paul and the life of the Apostle Paul, but this is unique. I think that you and your co-author do a great job of being concise and introducing your readers to a lot of different subjects. So I'm very thankful. You discuss the life of the apostle, the writings of the apostle, and the theology of the apostle. Those are the three main sections of your book, and a lot of excellent content there, and very concise in style. But you have also provided readers with resources and avenues to follow if they want to pursue and launch out to study more on any one of these given subjects.
Yeah, that's what we were really hoping we could do. We didn't want to provide the final word on everything. That's really impossible to do. I don't think any book can really do that anyway. But our main goal was to really just lay all the pieces out on the table, so to speak, and let people see what the key issues are, the key theories about Paul, the key pieces of evidence. And then if you have a student, or maybe there's a Bible study and someone in that Bible study reads a chapter and they want to pursue something in more detail, they definitely can, because we've referred to resources and pieces of evidence that they can read to get more background on those issues. So we hope it launches them off to more study in the future.
In today's podcast and the next podcast, we're focusing on the first main section of your book, in which you are the author of this section concerning the life of the Apostle Paul. There is indeed a lot of interest as it relates to what we know about the Apostle Paul for sure, and maybe what things we suspect to be true. And so I look forward to discussing those things with you in this podcast and in next week's podcast. Let's start by asking and answering the question, why is the study of the Apostle Paul's life a worthwhile endeavor?
I don't think that my reason would be all that different than anyone else, right? He's such a compelling figure and such a strong force. So if he writes half the New Testament books, then that's a good reason just by itself to want to study Paul. So he's played such a foundational role in Christian theology. Much of what we know about Christian doctrine, the basis of that Christian doctrine comes from Paul, because we have, of course, several narratives. We have the Gospels and we have Acts that tells the story of Jesus, the origin of the church, the early days of the church. But it's really in Paul's writings that we find the fullest expression of the gospel message and the implications of the message, how the promises of the Old Testament relate to the work of Jesus, what it means to be the church and live as the church in this new covenant period. So there's a lot of important theology in Paul, but also just his life it's a fascinating life. And I was kind of thinking about this the other day. We know probably more about Paul than all the other authors of the New Testament, right? But we still kind of really know nothing about him in many other ways. There's a lot of holes. And so in one sense, we have a lot of material to work through. We have all of his letters, we have Acts. So this is constantly giving us ideas for things to study. And we're constantly asking ourselves questions about this point or other or another in the life of Paul. But there's still so many holes. So there's a lot of things to explore here, just because he's such a predominant figure in the New Testament. So I would say those are some of the key reasons why I've just been drawn to Paul, and why many others are as well.
I have the privilege of teaching a course on Acts and Pauline epistles at Dallas Theological Seminary. I also teach a course on the Pauline epistles for the National Theological College and Graduate School. In these courses that I teach, I will list and discuss the various places in Scripture where Paul's testimony is given. His personal salvation testimony is given on multiple occasions in multiple different books. Of course, we think initially, first of all, in Acts chapter 9, where Luke records Paul's conversion experience on the road to Damascus, but then Luke records Paul's repeating of that testimony in front of a Jewish mob. And then, again, while standing before Herod Agrippa II on trial. Paul provides additional details in his epistles to the Galatians in chapter 1, and then in 1 Corinthians 15 regarding Jesus' post-resurrection appearance, and then also in Philippians and 1 Timothy. So we do indeed have quite a bit of data as it relates to Paul's conversion and his life story.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's quite a bit of data there. You have, as you said, the pastorals, you have Acts, you have references here and there in Paul's writing. So you definitely know more about him. It's not like you're reading, say, or studying Jude, for example, right? If you want to write a 800-page work, full biography on Jude, that would be really difficult to do. So we just have a few references in the early church to him, and it would be very difficult to pull something like that together. But with Paul, it's different. We have these hints here and there. We have, as you said, we have the testimony of Paul at different trials and different hearings, and before Hebrews and before Romans and all these different things. And so we're able to patch together different chapters in Paul's life and say a few things about them. But as I said, there's a lot of holes there as well that keep people like us busy.
Most Christians know the Apostle Paul was born in Tarsus, but don't know a lot more beyond that fact. What do we know about his birth and his early years?
Paul, of course, tells us that he was from Tarsus. And so he was constantly known or often known as Paul of Tarsus. And of course, it was very common in those days, especially among Jews, to refer to yourself by the location you were from. So he was Paul of Tarsus. Tarsus, if you were to look at a map today, it'd be the southeast corner of modern day Turkey. So it's right near the coast of, it would be the northern coast of Turkey there, or I should say of the Mediterranean Sea. So southern coast of Turkey. And this was a location that was very important commercially, or you could say economically, but then also as a hub of education as well. And so this was a very important place. And Paul even makes allusion to that, right? He's from no mean city, he says, right? He's from a very prominent place. It was a Roman colony that it wasn't like Nazareth that was barely on the map. This is a very important Roman city. And part of the reason for that is geographically, it was on this river that actually fed into the Mediterranean. So it'd be like if you were, I don't know, maybe this is something we can understand. In America, we have the Mississippi River, right, that goes inland here. So if you're in St. Louis or somewhere else, you can actually ship goods down the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico and across the Atlantic and everywhere in the world. And Tarsus was like that. It was just a little bit off the coast, but the river that went through it gave access to the Mediterranean. And so it was an important commercial hub for that reason. Fertile land all around, so agriculture was it was a good place for that. But even as far as education, this was a place you would want to go. It was like an Oxford or a Cambridge or in our case, Dallas and Lynchburg, right? Where you could go and study. And we know there were a lot of Stoic philosophers that were there for multiple centuries. You can go 2-3 centuries back from Paul, and even in the first century in Paul's day, there were a lot of Stoic philosophers that were there. So it was an important hub for philosophical learning. Also, there was a very large library there. So this was one of the largest libraries in the entire Roman world, and probably would have rivaled somewhere like Pergamum, or probably not as large as Alexandria or maybe Ephesus or something. But it was a very large library. So growing up, Paul would have been in that environment. He grew up, of course, in a Jewish home, but he was very much in a Roman setting, and that's going to influence him. And we can talk more about his training later, I suppose. But that would have been the basic kind of setting he grew up in, a large city that would have been multi-ethnic. There would have been Romans, there would have been Greeks, probably a lot of Jews that had settled there as well. So Paul was accustomed to interacting with people from a lot of different civilizations as well.
Dr. Laird, I appreciate the chapter that you have in your book on this topic of the Apostle Paul's early years. It certainly is helpful to learn about the city of Tarsus from extra biblical sources, sources outside of the Bible. As you indicate, Paul would have had a really good Hellenized education, and then later on, a very good Jewish education under Gamaliel in Jerusalem. Well, what do we know about Paul's family life?
I wish we knew more. We just have a few hints that come to us outside the New Testament from early Christian writers, and then a few passages where Paul refers to people in passing. That's about it. And yeah, in the book, I kind of give a basic survey of some of the people in Paul's family that he refers to. But one tradition that really is interesting is it comes to us in Jerome. And there's a couple of places in Jerome's writings where he refers to the background of Paul's family and how they actually got to Tarsus. So we talked a little bit about what life was like in Tarsus, but how did this Jewish family get there? Well, according to Jerome, and this is in his commentary on Philemon, and then probably more famously, he has this work called Lives of Illustrious Men. And so in that work, he actually tells us that Paul's family came from this small Jewish town called Gish or Gishala. The tradition of that Jerome shares, and this is again several centuries later, so you might question the accuracy of it, but it was a known tradition in the early church that they had Paul's family had migrated from Gishala, which is north of the Sea of Galilee, and moved west, migrated west into what is now Tarsus. And that took place when the Romans came into the land of Israel in the first century BC. So we're talking about maybe the 60s in the first century BC under Pompey and that period. So in one place, he tells us that they were prisoners of war. Another place, he just basically suggests that they kind of fled. So we don't really know the circumstances of that, but it appears that they ended up as slaves. That would be my best hunch. Maybe his grandfather was a slave who came from Gishala. The reason why we think this is because of the fact that Paul had Roman citizenship. And so you have to ask yourself, well, how did he become a Roman citizen? You didn't just become a citizen by just, living in a certain zip code. It was a status that had to be granted to you. And the natural way, for most people was you would have Roman parents, and both parents had to be Roman father and a Roman mother. So his parents must have both been Roman citizens. Well, how did they get citizenship then? Well, there's a good chance that maybe they were slaves of a Roman family, released, and then, as so often happens, they could have been then adopted into the family. And I would suggest maybe that this was a family known as the Paulus family. That was a established Roman name. And so most likely Paul's name was like a clan name that would have been used in that time. So that would suggest that the Paulus family was the adopted Roman family of Paul. And so because of that, he had Roman citizenship. So most likely his family came from Galilee. If Jerome is to be trusted, end up in Tarsus somewhere down the line. It could have taken decades. We don't know exactly, but family members, maybe Paul's father or his grandfather, received citizenship. That was passed on to Paul. So Paul grew up as a Roman citizen. He didn't have to, bribe his way into that or anything of that sort. That's a little of what we know about how he may have come to Tarsus. So then in the New Testament, we have different passages that refer to family members. Unfortunately, we don't have a full listing of their names, but he does refer to his father on one occasion. That's in Acts 23. Acts 23, he's making this speech before the Sanhedrin, and he refers to himself as a son. There's different readings in different manuscripts, whether it's singular or plural. He's a son of Pharisees, I should say. So it would be Pharisees, that would be plural there. So I think what he's alluding to there is not the fact that his father was a Pharisee. That would make more sense if you have the singular, I think. But I think he's probably making the case that he is a son in a figurative way, just like Timothy might be referred to as a son of Paul, or Peter might refer to Mark as a son in the faith. I think it's something more along those lines. So if you can imagine the setting there, he's before the Sanhedrin and he says, hey, I'm like one of you. I'm a son of Pharisees, plural. And he's kind of looking around the room there to people that he grew up with, that were his friends and colleagues and mentors, etc., basically saying, I am one of you. So I think it's doubtful that his actual father was a Pharisee, although some would dispute that. So that's one issue there with his father, but just one reference to him there in Acts 23. There's, of course, in the same chapter, just a little bit later in chapter 23, there's the reference to the nephew of Paul. When Paul is bound in Jerusalem, confined there in Jerusalem to protect him from the angry mob, his nephew learns of the plot and goes and tells the officer about this. And then also his sister is mentioned, and that's it. So I always wonder, did his sister relocate there with Paul? When Paul moved from Tarsus to Jerusalem as a young man, did his sister come with him? Did he come with other family members? I teach at Liberty, and oftentimes what will happen is freshmen may come here, and the parents decide to move here too, and they buy a house and in Lynchburg, and the student will stay with them, and the parents may get jobs and that type of thing. So there can be kind of a family movement, not just the student. So it could be something like that. We don't know. And it's not even clear if his sister was a believer. You could make the case that she was not, because how would his nephew learn about this plot if he was a known Christian? You could make the case that maybe he learned about this because he was actually on the other side of things. He was a non-Christian and maybe knew some information about the plot because he was hanging out with the Jews who were trying to kill Paul. I don't know, but there is that brief reference there to the sister. So that's about it. Of course, you can speculate about whether Paul refers to his wife. Some people in the early church thought that there might be a veiled reference to Paul's wife in Philippians, but that's very difficult to know for sure. I tend to think that Paul was not married, but there's an interesting reference there in Philippians 4. Translations do different things with it. Some might just say companion, the sugugos, right? Literally a yoke fellow. So was this individual that seems to be known by Paul in the church, was this individual just a companion in ministry? Well, some people think maybe that individual could have been Paul's spouse, because that term was known at times to be used for a spouse. And we think about it, the analogy actually works. I haven't seen a lot of Valentine cards or anything that use terminology like yoke fellow, but when you think about what it implies, right? You have two people that work side by side in tandem and in complete uniformity with each other in life, and so you could use that term as a spouse for a spouse, especially if you were, say, a Christian couple that were serving the Lord together. It might actually be fitting. So some would argue maybe he's alluding to his wife there, but I would say probably not. But that would be the other instance. So in some very little concrete information there about his family.
I appreciate the details that you have included in this book. As you indicate, there are things that we can be certain of from the biblical text itself. There are other things that we can deduce, and then there are things that there is a good bit of speculation about. Of course, we do know that Paul had Roman citizenship, as he said he was Roman when he was being beaten illegally. And of course, later on in the book of Acts, Paul appealed to give his case to Caesar, the right of every Roman citizen, and therefore he was taken to Rome. Could you mention other ways where a person could receive Roman citizenship?
Primary way would just be your parents. So just a natural, if you were not born a Roman, the best way to become a Roman citizen then would be to be adopted into a Roman family. And that often happened with slaves. So a slave would receive manumission, they might be adopted into a family, just like Josephus, right? His real name was not Flavius Josephus, that's his adopted Roman name. So he was adopted into the Flavian family. And so he then attained the status of the family member. So he became a Roman citizen that way. So that was actually the most common way.
And the slavery of the first century AD was primarily economical, correct? Not like 16th to 19th century slavery in America that was predicated upon race.
Yeah, that's right. And people would go into slavery for a lot of different reasons. You could be a prisoner of war. Possibly that happened to Paul's ancestors. We don't know. Prisoner of war, or at times people would be sold into slavery. There was the practice of exposure in the Roman world, that is, but in the first century, second century, where you would basically leave a child to the elements. You might leave them abandoned in the woods or near a trash heap or something, and somebody would come and pick the child off, and they would enter the slave market or be used as slaves. So that happened quite a bit too. So there were different forms of slavery, but it was very common, and it was not based on racial lines like we might think of it. It was an economic state, as you said. Some slaves were treated wonderfully, some were treated very miserably, but it was very common. And so, because you have so many slaves, that would be the most common way that individuals would become Roman citizens outside of natural birth, because you have so many of them that would actually be adopted into Roman families once they were released. And that might be another difference, right, with the slavery we think of in the American South or other places in the world, because slavery did not tend to be, at least in most cases, a lifelong experience. It was considered maybe a season of life. So you have people serving for a certain period. Oftentimes, when you get into adulthood, I'd probably be over the hill. So if I was a slave, they'd probably say you're no good anymore. You're eating more than you're worth, and you're taking too much to maintain. So they might let me go. But if you're 20 years old and you can do a lot of hard labor, you'd be a great asset to someone. So oftentimes they would be released around the age of 30 or so, and at that time they could be adopted into a family.
And the emperor could also grant Roman citizenship. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And that happened more into the late first century. So early on, they were a bit more stingy with that, right? But as time went on, more and more people were granted citizenship. So large populations and that type of thing. So it was still the minority of the people who were citizens, which is something we have a hard time getting our minds around, because we think of everyone who lives somewhere as a citizen, but it didn't work that way. It was definitely a status that most people didn't have, and valuable in many ways, if you could attain that. But yeah, the number of citizens does rise quite a bit as you go to the end of the first century.
The fact that the city officials had beaten Paul in Philippi, this is recorded by Luke in the book of Acts, chapter 16. They're beating him without asking him if he was a Roman citizen. This seems to indicate that the vast majority of people living in Greece were not Roman citizens. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's why Paul was constantly misidentified, and people just did not assume that he was a Roman citizen. You just wouldn't assume that. It would be very unlikely that a typical looking Jew would be a Roman citizen. That would have been very unusual. So they just assume he's not, and then they're shocked when they find out that he is. So that shows how rare it was in many places.
As it relates to Paul's marital status, many people argue that Paul was married because of his being an influential religious leader. Would you elaborate on that?
It was very common. That was the expected course of one's life, right? I mean, Jesus even alludes to this, right? That a man will grow up and leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. That's the normal course of things. And in Jewish culture, that's what you do when you're usually a teenager or so, you get married. And so it's often assumed that because Paul, of all people, was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I mean, this is a man you could say is as Jewish as it comes, as they come. Then he clearly would have been married. That would have been the normal course of action. So why would Paul decide not to get married? So many people just assume that he must have been. So there's that assumption there. But the problem is when we look at the New Testament, we don't find any clear references to Paul being married. Some would argue that perhaps, and it's possible, we have to leave room for this, but some would argue that it's possible that his wife abandoned him at the time of his conversion. So he was married as a young man, maybe in his teenage years, early 20s, somewhere along those, in that period of his life, he becomes a believer, and then she leaves him. Or it's possible that his wife dies, which was not unusual back then. A lot of people would die in their 20s, 30s, 40s. So I would be probably a senior citizen, right? At my age, once you hit about the age of 30, you were considered kind of a senior figure in Jewish society. And many women, of course, would die of childbirth, much more than today. And, in large Jewish families, if you have multiple children, there's actually a pretty high chance that you're not going to survive that, that you may succumb to death in one of those in one of those deliveries there. So it's very much possible that that happened to Paul's wife. Of course, we don't have any record of his children. So, if we had records of Paul's children running around, then we might put together that she abandoned him or she died in childbirth. But we don't have any record of any of that. But, there are a few references in 1 Corinthians 7 and chapter 9 as well, that some have suggested Paul may have been married, like when he's instructing those who are widowers to remain unmarried. and he uses the Greek meno there, right? So to remain. And so the suggestion is that Paul remained, he wasn't just unmarried, he remained unmarried. And so that would suggest to some that maybe Paul was like them. He had a former spouse and he was now single and chose not to remarry. So that's how some would read 1 Corinthians 7. And I already mentioned Philippians 4 with that reference to the yoke fellow. And even 1 Corinthians 9, Paul makes the argument, aren't we like all the other apostles who have the right to take along a believing spouse? And so the presumption is, some people read this, that Paul was married, but it wasn't that he chose not to be married, it's that he chose not to bring his spouse along. So that's how you would read 1 Corinthians 9, is that he was able to, he put aside that right to take Miss Paul with him, I guess you could say. The others, like Peter, decided to take, they would often travel with their spouse. As I said, there's no passage in Paul that suggests that Paul was married, and we see him traveling quite a bit. There's references to a lot of people who traveled with Paul, who knew Paul, and we never find a clear reference to a spouse. And then we have 1 Corinthians, of course. We know he was clearly unmarried at the time he wrote 1 Corinthians. So if he was married, it would have to be either, and this is what actually Clement of Alexandria in his student Origin argued, it would have to be a situation where he was married, but she lived elsewhere while he traveled around, or it would have to be the situation where his wife died. It has to be one of those two. And another argument that I find compelling, maybe others would disagree with me on this, Paul would suggest that being single and being married are both gifts. God has given each of us a gift, either to be married or to be single. And he makes the case, I would argue, that he had the gift of singleness. So he sees this not just as a state he happened to be in at a certain time of his life, but God had constituted him in a certain way. And so his singleness actually was a gift. And that's not something that you would just attain once you became a believer. That would be something that you'd be born in that way. So I think that Paul was unique in that sense, that he did not have that need for a companion like many of us do. That would be the normal way that we grow up, but normal course there. But for Paul, he was different, and he believed this was a gift of God, and God had given him that gift specifically for his own purposes, for God's purposes. And so he was able to leverage that, use that to advance the gospel. And we even see he's doing that before he converts, because even before he converts, he's traveling to different cities to persecute Christians. And that's probably not the kind of thing you would do. At least, if I was growing up and I had 5 children and a wife, I probably would be less inclined to do that than if I was a single, zealous, Jew who wants to, defend the faith. So that might even be another indication. So we see that passion, that inclination to travel. We find that even before he's a believer, and that could even indicate that he was single at that point as well.
How would you respond to someone that would say that an unmarried man would not be able to rise in the ranks and be as influential as Paul was, where indeed people were laying their garments at Paul's feet at the stoning of Stephen?
I think Paul was able to, just through sheer hard work and passion and skill and expertise, he was able to gain, I think, a lot of respect. This is somebody who was clearly devoted to the law, who had a strong reputation for his passion for the scriptures, but his knowledge for scripture as well. So it may have been the kind of thing that he had to work especially harder than maybe a normal person who was married with children, possibly. I'm just kind of theorizing here. He might have had to overcome that, but I think he did gain quite a reputation for his zeal. He would have been known for, I think if you could describe him, in those early years, one of the first words you might come up with is, this is a zealous, passionate young man, right? And so I think his hard work, his dedication to the faith was well known. And even though he didn't come from a traditional background, in the sense that he doesn't appear to be married with children, I think that reputation would have been pretty well known at this point.
Well, our time is up for this episode of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, but we're not finished discussing this book, 40 Questions about the Apostle Paul. So please return next episode to listen and join us and Dr. Laird as we discuss this great book. And don't forget that Kriegel has agreed to send a free book to one of you, and I will send an additional free copy to another one of you. So if you'd like to be entered in a drawing to receive one of the two books being given away, published by Kriegel, entitled 40 Questions About the Apostle Paul, all you need to do is head over to our YouTube page, Bible and Theology Matters, and like this episode and share it on one or more of your social media platforms. Then please leave me a comment on our YouTube channel that you have reposted the episode. But if you don't use YouTube, but you are on Facebook or Instagram, you can also go over to our Bible and Theology Matters accounts on these platforms and like and reshare these posts. Again, make sure to send me a note on YouTube preferably, but if you don't have a YouTube account, you can post a comment on our Facebook or Instagram accounts that you have reposted this episode. In 2 weeks from the release of this episode, we will have a drawing for the 2 free copies. And if you're not one of the 2 winners, you'll want to head over to Kriegel.com and acquire your own copy of 40 Questions About the Apostle Paul. Well, I hope that you'll join us again next week. But as always, until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, theologymatters.com.